The way I set up the book, each chapter I open with like a personal anecdote that connects with the character or with the group that I'm covering. And I did that because I wanted, as I said in the book, I wanted to make history personal, just given how the genesis of the book came to be. I really wanted to have this moment where I'm actually personally connecting with the characters and learning something deep. And so every chapter opens with a personal story from me, an anecdote as to why I'm picking this person. And then the chapter ends with my takeaways, because that's how I was writing and researching and journaling through the writing of the book. And so I wanted to focus on lesser known people. I think a lot of times when we think about activism or we think about history, we know most of males, especially older kind of middle-aged men like MLK, Malcolm X, Bayard Rustin, John Lewis. He was much younger as well when he first kickstarted, but I really wanted to focus on those who were lesser known because I feel they were always the backbone of the movements, but they weren't forefront enough to get the big name or the big recognition that we have in the history books. So it just started from just reading through a lot of news archives from that time. I wanted to cover 100 years just because I wanted to bookmark with 2020. So that was my first thought. I needed a time frame. So I looked at 100 years because it bookmarked with 2020. And because the first person I really stumbled upon and really was moved by was Ella Baker in her time at Shaw University, and how the first protest that she upheld was just allowing female students to wear silk stockings, something that's simple. She took on because she felt we should be able to have full autonomy of our bodies to do what we want to do. So that's where it started. That particular incident and protest began in 1918. So that bookmark of 100 years came from there because I knew I wanted to start with her and that particular protest in 1918. So really is 1918 to 2020. And the rest of the characters came in a similar way where I would just spend time going through news archives and connecting what was happening in the country. You know, was it post-World War I, post-World War II? Was it the Depression era? What was happening and what movements were forming as a result of that? So, for example, one of the characters I spent a lot of time with was Barbara Johns. I was so drawn to her because at just 16, she led a massive student strike during the Brown versus Board of Ed time. She knew that the conditions that her all-Black school was subjected to was just not right. Though I love how she came to that moment to know that she could do something. And so I spent a lot of time just studying her psychology. She was politically charged and moved by her uncle Vernon, who was a minister, but he was also this major community activist who was practical, but also a dreamer because he knew that if you can build a coalition of people, of like-minded people, and convince them that together our voice is stronger, but also individually knowing that you have a voice and that your voice is your weapon. So that was one of the ways that she was charged to do something, but also she grew up in a home with a grandmother, her paternal and maternal grandmother. They had survived and they had gone through the enslaved years. So they were telling her stories about subjugation, how inherently they were seen as nothing. They were seen as property. Like this was what was forming who she was. So by the time she was 16, kind of seeing her own moment of injustice, she felt like, I need to do something. And to me, that was just fascinating that a 16-year-old thought, you know what, this doesn't make sense. Enough is enough. I'm going to do something. And she convinced an entire school body to protest against the school district, to let them know what we're going through. This is not right. We cannot be having classes in tar paper shacks. When it rains on us. How is this fair? We cannot be so overcrowded that we then have to have our classes in a school bus. And at the same time, the all-white school up the block, they have a new garden. We have no building, but they have a new garden. They have a new library. How is this just? How does this reflect the Constitution? we need to do something. And her protesting and striking was so disruptive, it caught the attention of the NAACP, who at the time they were working to bring the Brown case to the Supreme Court. So because of her, of the 177 students represented in the Brown case, 117 came from Prince Edward County just because she looked around and she said, enough is enough. So Barbara Johns, I wrote about Charlie Baker. He founded the Freedom School. I wrote about, again, Ella Baker. So all these young people similarly understood that they needed to do something and that they had a voice. And if that's all they had, that was enough because it was powerful enough to use to bring about change. I think overall, one of the biggest takeaways for me, and just kind of like moving decade to decade, even now, is we have to understand that freedom is not free. Freedom wasn't free. We even see it today with Dobbs, what happened with Dobbs. We see it with what happened with affirmative action. So many things have happened, and we are almost in this slow regression. And I always say we're regressing to a time, I mean, not as far back as Jim Crow, but there is a little of a regression happening, especially with now Trump coming to office and some of the policies that he's supporting. We're regressing because people don't realize that history is the best teacher. You cannot go forward without understanding how we got here, the struggles that got us here, the people who fought for this democracy that we all inherit. So I think as I went through each decade, the same themes kept recurring because the same issues kept recurring. I think about, I talk about the Gina 6 in 2006, how they were met with the gravest of injustice in Louisiana. And you think this is modern times, they were threatened with a noose in 2006 because people are not being intentional in turning to history to understand how we got here, how important it is, and how precious our democracy is, and how it takes all of us to be participants in the democracy to uphold it and safeguard it. And this is something I saw in every generation, but it's almost like the mantle is not being passed successfully because those people who are coming afterward are not paying attention to history as a guide. They're just living in this moment and just fighting the injustice in the moment, as opposed to turning to history to say, how did we get here in the first place? What is the best way to build a coalition of people of diverse voices, diverse experiences? Because, for example, a lot of young people today are extremely idealistic, and that's good. They inject energy into every movement, but also I think we need to also have a coalition that has young people and a bit more experienced older people, because older people tend to be more pragmatic because they were once idealistic. Then they got into the fighting, they got into the building of the coalition and saw just how difficult it is to get a buy-in if everyone is not on the same page and understanding just how important history is, how important democracy is, how important the Constitution is. You can't force people to learn and understand this. So that's why it's become almost every generation, it does get easier in understanding, but in upholding and building the coalition, it's a bit more challenging because not everyone is being intentional in understanding just how we got here. So that's where the challenge still lies. That's why even tapping into the idea that your voice is your weapon, it's not bought in by everyone because not everyone has been intentional to tap into that. Johnetta Elzey is one that comes to mind. She was at the forefront of the Ferguson protests following Michael Brown's death. And the same thing I just mentioned, I remember those one scene she described to me where, she and Al Sharpton, who was, he's a steward when it comes to the movements from decades prior. And one of the things she said is he was not serving the young people because he was telling them to be quiet and don't do as much protesting in the way they were doing it. Don't be so loud with it. Change takes time. substantive change takes time. And they were looking for change now, where he was saying to them, well, no, change, as I've seen it in my experience, my 40 plus years of doing this work, substantive change is going to take longer. I may not even live to see that change. Just like Martin Luther King talked about, he had a dream. He didn't live to see that dream. So I remember she was describing there was this protest that she went to, well, this rally that she went to that Al Sharpton was leading, and she got up to the stage and told him, "You're not serving us." And so they had this back and forth, exactly what I was mentioning earlier, where she's saying we need to be more active, and he's just saying, "Well, we are being active in a different way. We're being more systematic because we know how we got here." And so I think that disconnect is what I'm seeing with the newer generation and the older generation when it comes to working together and building. I think they need to build that intergenerational coalition, and I think that's where we start to see some more substantive change.